Gwendraeth did two first degrees and a diploma in bilingualism in Aberystwyth University. She was a Welsh teacher at Ysgol Preseli, and then lectured in grammar in Lampeter, and she also helped out with the Welsh Department at Trinity College. She completed a PhD in Cardiff under Professor E.Wyn Thomas on the orthography of denominational publications in the 19th century. And now she's going to talk about the spelling was spoiled, the issue of the orthography in the 19th century. The title of this presentation comes from the 1814 that look about what was happening to orthography in Wales in 1793 and the problems with that. The problems with orthography achieved its zenith in 1793 when there was a radical spirit in the land, mainly because of the French Revolution. And we will start our presentation in 1793 and move forward chronologically. In February that year, the first edition of the Cylchgrawn Cymraeg, the Welsh magazine, appeared, published by the Radical Baptist Morgan John Rhys. On the third page of that magazine, we see these. You see there you have C cedilla instead of CH, instead of a double F, an F, and then instead of a single F in Welsh would be V. And then the sentence, a radio, I can't know what it was going fan hyn. And it goes forward to say we don't need to double the N or R in most situations in Welsh. The name at the bottom of the contribution is E.Wyn of Eirion. That was William Owen Pugh. He was a member of the Gwendraeth Society in London, which was a radical society supporting the French Revolution. And in this radical magazine, he starts to publish some of the system he put together to change the orthography. Morgan John Rhys is very much in favour of this and says the next editions of the magazine would use Pugh's orthography. But so much trouble happened as a result of this that Rhys had to drop that possibility. And also include David the Earry's criticisms. He was a churchman and a friend of Peter Bailey Williams, Cymreigydd's priest. But another controversy had arisen by then. In 1793, on the 1st of February, France declared war on Britain, and a day of fasting and prayer was announced for 19th of April, and throughout the country there was to be a morning service with the anti-communion and an evening service, and there would be a special publication of a leaflet with details of the service and what would be prayed, and everybody had to use those. Well, the clerics of Wales didn't expect anything different, and then they saw a very strange orthography and nothing to explain what they were. the headline on the first page and the instructions about the service were in this strange orthography and the prayers as well. And here's part of it on the screen now. That was what faced them. An F or a double F, a V, and then the strange accents, and then you have Fawr Hydy, Majesty has a V instead of F, and then Barhau continue is a strange spelling as well. So very strange orthography. Well, because of this, many of the churches didn't use the prayers, and the priests went to the bishops to complain and to explain why they didn't use the prayers, because that could be interpreted as a treasonous one in a time of war. And all the bishops were Englishmen, Warren in Bangor, Horsley in St David's, Bagod in Llynasaf, and Watson in Llandaff. And they, of course, didn't understand what all this meant, but they were very happy because this could have been interpreted as a political act against the establishment at a very difficult time. Who was the translator? The priest of Cymreigydd knew at once, because David the Eryri would have told him about what happened with the Cylchgrawn Cymraeg. But everybody knew very soon that it was on the London Gwendraeth who translated a man of the name of William Pugh, and the accusation starts. John Williams, the schoolmaster of Llanrwst, it's in touch with Pugh himself to declare his complaint.
The infamous translation, as it is styled, of the prayers for the last past, the clergy of this country attribute to me.
And then Henry Parry, a priest in Holywell, writes about David Gofal ein Gwinllan, who was studying for the priesthood.
E.Wyn has broke his shins with the Welsh clergy by his introduction of new orthography to the Welsh language.
Well, the storm quietened gradually, but it was still in the memory in 1811 of John Roberts, the vicar of Cymreigydd, when he said,
John Roberts, vicar Cymreigydd, the occasional prayers, owing to the orthography and the obsoleteness of the language in which the translation appeared, their effect as forms of devotion was much impaired, and these impediments to a devout use of them were felt by the clergy.
So it affected the worship, said the clergy, and that's why they were angry. It'd be reasonable to believe that the Pugh's orthography we'd never seen on church documents afterwards. But some do appear from 1997 onwards, not enough to cause controversy, but to show that the King's press in London hadn't realised the controversy and used the translator again. And they show how Pugh was very sly in a way of pursuing his cause. But there were people within the clergy who were careful to make sure that Pugh's orthography didn't get an open door into the church. Well, that door having been shut, Pugh saw that he wouldn't be able to extend his orthography if he didn't be able to use it for the scriptures, which most people were reading at the time. And then SPCK were going to produce another edition of the Bible, and they're going to ask Gwendraeth Morgan, who was curate of Vineyard, to edit the text so Pew saw his chance, and he asked Gwendraeth.
If I thought it would be gained over to think it expedient to introduce an orthography like the dictionary, I would then draw up a plan to put into the hands of
But Gwendraeth wasn't able to be part of this. It's the John Roberts we spoke of already, who did the proofreading of the 1799 Bible. He'd been recommended by Joseph Hoare, the head of Jesus College, who came from Cardiff. But in this very unexpected way, another door opened. Gwendraeth Morgan wrote in 1799 to Pew.
There is a Welsh magazine on foot again. The editors are the Reverend Thomas Charles and the Reverend Thomas Jones.
They say they're agreed. They agree with the knowledgeable E.Wyn about certain different ways of spelling, and they thought this was the orthography for the future. Who couldn't believe it, I'm sure. Here were the Methodist churchmen who didn't like the Cymreigydd because of the radical views, offering to use the orthography of Pew, which had been condemned by lay and clerics in the church. And by the time Pew received Morgan's letters, one edition of the Tryswydda Ysbrydol had been produced. So it has these orthographical points that Pew was in favour of. When we look at the correspondence, it was Thomas Jones's idea to use Pew's orthography. That's strange, because he was taught in the classical languages by John Lloyd, Vicar of Caerwys, and the father, Angharad Llwyd. He was a poet and produced hymns, including the famous Rhywun Fod Rhan Fyw, and he produced very effective theology, like Gair yn Amser in a good Welsh. He knew it was this scholarly person who had agreed to accept Pew's ideas. Maybe he thought that Pew was resurrecting the Bardic alphabet. This Tresorfa magazine didn't last long. It didn't pay. It was said that the Methodist diocese weren't happy with orthography because it was different from the orthography of the Bible. So that door into literary, religious literature in Wales shut to Pew. But his influence became very little. And but salvation came again, and that from Thomas Charles himself. If it was strange that Thomas Jones, what he's been drawn by Pew, it was much stranger that happened with Charles as well. He wasn't interested in poetry, and he didn't have such a grasp in the Welsh language or interest in it. But he must have known that Pew followed Joanna Southcott, who suggested that she was the woman in the Apocalypse who gave birth to a son, and who believed she would give birth to the Messiah, new Messiah, in 1814. It's strange that Charles would actually accept Pew, but it must have been what Pew said about keeping the purity of the old language that won Charles over. He was enchanted by the idea that Welsh was close to Hebrew, the first language of the world, and that was a language that should be used to talk about the spiritual. So he gave Pew the chance of seeing his dream come true, of seeing his orthography in the Bible. Well, the Belgian Foreign Libel Society was established in 1804 by Charles and other, and immediately it was decided to publish Welsh language Bibles. Charles offered himself as editor and Pew as proofreader for the University Press in Cambridge. And then in November, Charles sent some proofs to the society, and he followed Pew in changing DI to DY, for example. And you see these on the screen. So on the left, you see here from Genesis, Psalm 52, and Proverbs, the 1799 Bible. And Charles changes it, and the same with the next. And Tin Ram, here comes Tin and Ann Mirhed. And Mr. Tan, without knowing what all these meant, thanked him. But John Roberts had found out that Charles and Pew were changing the orthography of the Bible, and then on the last day of December 1804 sends a letter to the SBK talking about these changes and referring that bishops had authorized the changes, and saying that it was two leading characters among the Methodists who were behind it. Well, correspondence started in earnest then, and the Bishop of London ordered that the work should finish immediately until inquiries should be made. But the Lord Teignmouth wanted the work to carry on, but the bishops did not agree. The Act of Vineyard 1862 referred to the Welsh as well as the English Bible, and a new edition had to be authorised by the four bishops of Wales and the Bishop of Hereford. The end of it all, that members of the Parliamentary Committee of the University of Cambridge, and they contacted Gwendraeth Morgan, and he said, by interpretation, verbal, literal, and sacred code, the critics meddles with edged tools, and also I'm rather biased against innovations in translation of the scripture. So Charles, in the end, agreed to keep the traditional orthography, and at the beginning of 1806, he warns Pew, be sure not to alter a word. And
you must remember that we are narrowly watched, and you should be better than heretics.
They would be thrown out of church and churchyard if they made those changes. But even in August 1805, Pew writes to Gwendraeth Morgan asking him to leave the apostrophe out, one of his other rules. It would be better if it concentrated on corrections rather than that, because when the Bible was published, the 8th chapter of Judges was missing. The verse 33 of Psalm 105 was repeated instead of verse 36, and part of the fourth verse of Jeremiah 35 was missing. Well, one of the results of this, that the SPCK made sure that the 4 bishops and the bishops of Hereford authorised their edition of the Bible in 1809, which had the Book of Common Prayer attached to it. Another result was that there was suspicion between Methodist and Methodist this time, because although John Roberts wrote the letter which started the trouble, as John Humphreys, who was blamed by Charles. And so it said about John Humphreys that John Humphreys spoke in favour of the orthography to John Roberts, the priest of Cymreigydd. Another result of this, that the Pew's orthography started to be seen as an anti-church thing, and was seen as perverting doctrine and favouring dissent. And that is seen throughout the decade and increased in strength over time. But even more important was the fear that the strange orthography would turn people against the Bible in Welsh. So this is how Thomas Bayon, the Archdeacon of Cardigan, wrote to the Bishop of St David's in May 1805.
I believe that it is the general wish that no attempt be made to introduce into the Bible the new orthography adopted by Mr. E.Wyn in his Welsh dictionary. It would be universally disliked.
So that was not, it wasn't only in that decade that was fear was expressed, but the scriptures for the time were saved from Pew. But it was still used in the new Tresorfa and Charles's editorship in 1809, and many books which were produced by the Bala Press in Pew's orthography. Methodist clergy and their followers left the church in 1811, and Thomas Charles died in 1814. Not before, according to Gofal ein Gwinllan, that using an instead of am in the Bible that he used that year. This was noted as one of the few benefices in the edition of 1814. Yet, things were fairly quiet about the orthography until the Cymreigydd, the weekly magazine, appeared in the first week of January 1814 under the editorship of Joseph Harris, the Baptist. You only have to look and you'll see the Pew's orthography that would be used in this new magazine. But everything seems quiet until the fourth item, until an Idris Vychan accuses the Pewites of weakening the language under the pretext of making it better. And then we have people saying how wonderful Pew's orthography was, and then Eliezer, vicar of Peter, the son of Peter Williams, the who wrote the on the Bible, and he says that these people were ignorant of the language compared to John Davies Mallwyd. Eliezer maintains that it was the the French Revolution that began this change in the orthography. And he says that the C cedilla as something with a French tail. He says that Pew, of course, suggested he was recovering the roots of language, but his critics said he was just producing something new. And there was a fear that the new orthography would become between people and their Bibles, and that it was actually destroying the Bible. And he says that the people who didn't read that service in 1793 made sure that this blasphemy didn't invade the sacred space. Well, Eliezer was down in Carmarthen in 1819 at the Eisteddfod, which was supported by Bishop Burgess. This society set as one of the conversations in 1823 an essay on the orthography, and John Roberts was found to have won for reasons for rejecting the Welsh orthography. It is proposed now to be introduced. The same reasons are given as Eliezer, that it was something new that was stitched together, and if it infected the scriptures, it would be a barrier between a reader or listener in a Bible. And he notes other things. The first had been noted many years before, that the orthography created a split between church people and nonconformists, and that it was an anti-church orthography, but also that it would turn people against the Welsh language and to English. He was right, because this is what was said in Cymreigydd in 1822, and I put him on the screen so you can read with me. Mr. Gomer, I want to ask you why there is so much variation in our Welsh language as written. Maybe we should all learn English, which would be better for us in worldly terms than Welsh. And Welsh, as it is, we become so confused that it will be forgotten very soon, just as our forebears disagreed with each other and lost their country. So disagreement between us and each other about the language will ensure its disappearance from the earth. And in the Disgedau, the independent newspaper, it was also said in the same way. In the 1820s, a Gwyliedydd, the Church of England newspaper, becomes an area for a controversy about this, and made sure that that magazine to disappear for a while the non-conformist publications were rising popularity. John Jones Bala, Ioan Tegid, who had been supporting Pew. In 1822, John Jones, as Ioan Tegid, was chaplain in Christchurch in Oxford, and then he started his attempt to bring Pew's orthography into the Book of Common Prayer and the Bible. His first act was to try to publish an edition of the Book of Common Prayer, including Pew's orthography, from Clarendon Press. And although he didn't have the permission of the university officials, the work started. But Van Mildert, Bishop of Llandaff, got hold of some of the proofs from the Reverend Bruce Knight, who was examining chapter at Llandaff, and compared it to the Standard Book of Common Prayer, and found 203 changes to align with Pew, and the work was stopped. But in 1826, he had the opportunity to edit a bilingual testament to be published by the Clarendon Press. He had told the publishers that he would follow the 1809 Bible, including Charles's revision in 1814, and the Bible Society agreed. But before starting the work, Tegid, who was the canon presenter in Christchurch, had sent a letter to Gwalter talking about his intention to change in Pew's way some of the orthography, and not to tell anybody. The blind leader of the blind, the polyphemus of the flock, John Roberts, the author of the essay in anti-church orthography. And this Pewite text was published before people realised, but the SPCK refused to buy copies. All the details about the bilingual testament didn't come to light until 1828, when Tegid had edited an edition of the New Testament in Welsh, including Pewite forms. By this, Bruce Knight of Llandaff was after him, and the Bible Societies were talk about the strange orthography, and all the copies were refused. So the work of the two societies were affected, and Welsh readers had a barrier between themselves and the Bibles. Well, Tegid then turned round to undermine the old orthography and its supporters. We're producing a pamphlet attacking John Roberts' essay, even though John Roberts had died by then, and he made insulting comments about Roberts' work. There's little work, futile arguments, puerile passages, and he finished it all by saying that the ignorance of the people who spotted the old orthography would disappear in a very short time. Ignorance must lead to knowledge, and illiterate prejudice give way to conviction. William Knight was Bruce Knight was incensed. The vicar of Llandoch and dean before the end of his life, and a scholar in Welsh and Hebrew, and he responded in an incendiary way to John to John Jones's pamphlet. He's just saying that he was talking nonsense. He talks about that John Davis's orthography had become the standard orthography. Then he says that people try to undermine, subvert the system, and is saddened that this orthographical battle had come into the sacred space where the Bible and the Book of Prayers, which were authorized by bishops, were being undermined, and congregations becoming confused. then we need to speak out up against this unnecessary orthographical change. And he says that John Roberts' essay should be supported. In taking my leave of this subject, I trust Mr. Jones' pain. In preference to him, I have Dr. Davis as my guide. Jones couldn't give in because he'd boasted so much about his linguistic abilities, and Pew was still looking to him, and he again published in 1832 saying that there were many mistakes in the earlier Bibles except for the one produced by Charles 1814, and boasting his New Testament 1828 even the Bible societies had rejected it. Gwendraeth had had enough of this, and he responded, and the heading of his pamphlet suggested what was in it: a critical view of Robert John Jones' reply. He defended the Bible text, and he was surprised that Tegid, a cleric, couldn't respect the authority of the church he served in. He said that he'd used deceit to bring Pew's orthography into the church, and he said he was trying to work evil. He it is over several years labouring a cry against the deceived text. He alone that has given so much trouble and so much anxiety to the principality. There's a note at the end of this work, gan Taliesin Iolo, the son of Iolo Morgan, saying that he'd read John Jones's contribution and come to the conclusion that Dr. Davis' orthography was the right one and much better than Pew's system. Which was slightly less harsh than his father's comments that Pew's orthography was shameful. At the end of the century, John Morris Jones supposed Knight was saving the Wise Bible from vandalism Pew's followers. Well, the attempt to change the orthography of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer was a failure, but it caused splits and difficulties. It undermined the Welsh-language magazine of the church at a critical time and ensured that Welsh-speaking clergy spent their time on fantasy rather than looking to increasing the Welshes of the established church in Wales, and confused Welsh leaders and drove them to the English language, increasing the mentality which is growing more popular that the Welsh should live their lives through English. So a quick look at this orthographical saga in the 19th century. Thank you very much, Gwendraeth. Very interesting, that story. And I don't think the clergy have changed very much. We like a bit of drama, don't we? There's an opportunity for about 5 minutes for you to ask your questions. If you want to put your question in the chat, or if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a reaction button, and if you can raise your virtual hand there, you can ask questions like that as well. While you're considering that, I might have a little question. I think, Gwendraeth, you spoke at the end that there was a bit of time wasting on this controversy. Do you think it has been very damaging in terms of the faith in Wales, but the faith in particular in the church in Wales? Well, it was to some extent. It was bound to be because the clerics were falling out with each other to start with, and also, and it is it didn't affect the Bibles of the church himself or the Book of Prayer in the church, but outside the actual central church, it wasn't good between different Catholics. So the politics were difficult, and people were wasting time on arguing rather than spending time on more important things. That's the truth. So very interesting. So, a chance to ask a question. That Pew's suggestions look quite similar to the Breton language. Is it an accident? Was he trying to create some Celtic connections in there? So maybe there was some influence there, but really he went back to old manuscripts. He was stitching things together. There wasn't, so the Breton influence wasn't there on Pew himself, but there was still the same ideas going around in Brittany slightly earlier. So there were people putting forward strange suggestions about the language in Brittany as well. Well, we've run out of time now, but there'll be an opportunity to discuss this further at the end of the webinar. But now we have Professor E.Wyn James, and I'm just going to read a blurb. He spoke about himself that before retiring, he says, well, I don't think he really has retired. He's very busy. He was a professor of Welsh in Cardiff University, teaching modules on literature and culture in Welsh from the 16th century onwards. He was also the co-director of the Welsh American Studies in Cardiff University. He has focused on the ballads and folk music, evangelical literature, the anti-slavery movement, and the Welsh colony in Patagonia, and he's going to talk about Thomas Price Carnhuanawc, Welshman, Celt and Christian. I'm going to start with referring to Dr. John Davies, the author of Hanes Cymru, published in 1990, History of Wales, and that actually echoes the title of Carnhuanawc's History of Wales of 1842. And John Davies says that Thomas Price Carnhuanawc, he was one of the great Welshmen of the 19th century. But I go a bit further. I would say that Carnhuanawc was the greatest Welshman between 1818 and his death in 1848. And I refer to 1818 because I see that here as the beginning of a national renewal, which we connect to the Cymreigydd movement, the development of the new Eisteddfodau, and the literary priests as well. But I would say Carnhuanawc, even though there was a lot of combination, Carnhuanawc maybe was the greatest Welshman of that period between 1818 and 1848. And yet, I doubt how many people here today know anything about him or have even heard his name, except for the fact that the Carnhuanawc Society, established some decades ago to encourage a study of Welsh history, that they have used the title, this name in their title, and I think John Davies actually probably encouraged that. But before talking about Carnhuanawc and his history, his character, I'm going to use about half of my time to ask the question, why has his name and his contribution has been forgotten when he was such an important figure in our history in the first part of the 19th century? Well, trying to answer that question will help us to fill in the background to his work and his life and work and the work of the church. Now, he was from Breconshire, and he lived most of his life there. But the first thing to emphasize is that the Wales he was born into in 1787, that Wales was very different to the Wales where he died, when he died in 1848. One thing, there was a huge demographic change. Now, his the county of his birth, Breconshire, we didn't have a dense population and that no large towns, so that was true about most of Wales at the time. He was born in the north of Breconshire, in the Bilth area, and even though he spent most of his time as an Anglican priest from about 1813 until his death in the Cymreigydd area in the south of the county. But that county was still quite rural. That part was still quite rural. But by his time in Cymreigydd, he was within sight, almost literally, to the great industrial developments which connected with the heads of the valleys in southeast Wales. He was a witness to those industrial developments which began in the second part of the 19th century and developed hugely in the first part of the 19th century with the growth of the iron industry in the valleys and the heads of the valleys to start with. That was the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, wasn't it? And that development meant that the country was born in 1787 with a sparse population, less than 500,000 throughout Wales, and fairly evenly distributed across the country, mainly rural, without big towns. By the end of his life in 1848, the population of Wales had more than doubled, and many of the inhabitants lived in the lively industrial towns, which were within a stone's throw of his home in Cymreigydd. The population of southeast Wales quadrupled from 100,000 people in 1800 to 400,000 people in 1850. An incredible growth in this area, which was within sight almost of his home, and became part of his priestly territory as well. If you look about the area around E.Wyn and Gwendraeth Morgan, not Gwendraeth Morgan in West Morgan, but the ones in the Abergavenny area. We think about those developments were just 5 miles south of Carnhuanawc, so but he was still in a fairly rural area himself, and we'll come back to that again. Well, a great political change during his life as well. The Wales of his life was quite conservative. His early life was quite conservative. People, doffed their cap to the squire. They respected the class hierarchy, and many of them were quite happy to do that as well. But at the time of Carnhuanawc's birth, there were the seeds of change in the land. So the American War of Independence had occurred just before his birth, and then just after his birth, in 1789, 2 years after he was born, we see the French Revolution, and that was a sign that great changes were happening. The growth of radicalism, a challenging of the hierarchical system. Richard Price, the philosopher from Glamorgan, was responsible for emphasizing that authority in society comes from below the people, rather than the old emphasis on the king's divine right to reign. Authority came from below, and that changed the situation, and the growth of radicalism and liberalism was moving apace in the first part of the 19th century, so that Wales in 1848, when Carnhuanawc died, was much more radical and liberal than the Wales he was born into, and great religious changes as well in the same time. Carnhuanawc was the son of an Anglican priest, and became an Anglican priest, a loyal Anglican until he died. And most of Wales in the 18th century were very loyal to the established church, the parish church, the Anglican church, whatever you call it. That church was a very important central part of the life of the ordinary people. Generally in the 18th century it was an established church, so ceremonies for regarding birth, marriage and death were all connected to the parish church. The festivals of the church, the patronal festivals, gave the poor peasants some kind of holiday in the midst of their hard lives. And then the church also was responsible for things. It was almost like parish or county council, responsible for the poor, for the roads in the area. And many of the Welsh of the 18th century were very well disposed towards the established church, the Church of England, especially in the first part of the 18th century. 9 out of 10 of the people of Wales were members of the established church in the first part of the 18th century. There was only about 5% of the people who were nonconformists at the beginning of the 18th century, and you'll get the balladeers talking about the Church of England as the enlightened, joyous church. And you see the same attitudes in, we've looked at this already, in the work of E.Wyn and Theophilus Evans. She was the old mother of Hen Van, but during the life of Carnhuanawc, we see great changes happening religiously as well. It had started and the Methodist revival in the 1730s. By the time Thomas Charles moved to the Bala in 1784, that Methodist movement has become stronger throughout Wales, and the influences of that evangelical revival spread to the Baptists and the independent congregations, and we see a growth not just in Methodism but among the non-conformists in general, becoming more and more evangelical, and the Methodists leaving the church in 1811, and all of this. And by the middle of the 19th century, by the time of Carnhuanawc's death, 4 out of 5 people who went to worship at all went to the nonconformists and not the established church. And what we see by the middle of the century, by 1848, we're increasing tension between the nonconformists who had become a strong social force, who are opposing tithes and the privileges of the established church and its Englishness. It had turned from being an hen van, the old mother, to be an old foreigner by the death of Carnhuanawc. So amazing changes socially, politically and religiously. That's one reason why I think that Carnhuanawc has been forgotten. We could say that the country Carnhuanawc was born into, that conservative, hierarchical, rural, Anglican country, disappearing before his eyes during his life, especially the southeast of Wales. This area was developing this industrial urban life, even though he lived in this part of Wales where he could see all these developments happening from his bedroom almost in Crickhowell. Carnhuanawc, in many ways, until his death, belongs to the old Wales of the 18th century. He was more at home in the old Wales than the new Wales that was happening around him. And literally, he lived in the rural Wales, even though he was so close to the industrial areas of the southeast. He was very conservative politically, as was his sponsor, Lady Llanova. He was against the Chartist movement, and he was a leading figure in the Cymreigydd of Abergavenny, which included a lot of the higher echelons of society, and close connections with London. Well, her husband gave his name to the bell, accurately, in Big Ben, and they were friends with the royal family, etc. So it's important to underline as well that Carnhuanawc did see the value of the ordinary people as well, even though it was part of the social hierarchy, but in a paternalistic way. To quote Dr. John Davies, across Europe in the first part of the 19th century, many clerics very often wanted to enfranchise different ethnic groups, and Carnhuanawc is the most obvious example in Wales, and under the influence of philosophers like Herder in Germany. People like Carnhuanawc emphasized the non-state cultures and languages that they need to be preserved, and he saw the ordinary people as the guardians of these cultures. So Carnhuanawc pay tribute to the ordinary people because they kept the literature and the ways of Wales, but within this hierarchical conservative context, the squire, the vicar, and the ordinary people all within one community, politically and religiously, rather than the kind of class division that was increasing by the end of his life. And Carnhuanawc was a very loyal Anglican. That's another thing which is important about him compared to the new world he was living in by the end of his life. And despite the Anglicization of the higher echelons of the Anglican Church, you think about the E.Wyn Farrell complained about these English bishops. And even though Carnhuanawc was very ecumenical in cooperating with people of very different political and religious convictions, he was ready to work with everybody who was in favour of Welsh language and culture. Carnhuanawc himself depart the Anglicanization of the church, was a very loyal Anglican, and he was a rural dean before the end of his life. So by the end of his life, in 1848, Wales, as I've shown, I hope, was a very different place to the Wales of his youth, and the political and religious tensions were increasing, and not least because of what happened in the year before he died, which was the treason of the Blue Books in 1847, though 3 English Anglican commissioners attacking the state of education in Wales, attacking the culture of Wales and the morals of Wales, and suggesting that all these problems were the result of the Welsh language and non-conformity. And even though that although some Anglicans, at A.J. Johns, for example, were leading in the opposition to this, the impression was given of these nasty conservative English Anglicans attacking the Welsh, and the Welsh being more or less nonconformist radicals by now. Well, we see the people like William Wraithog, Henry Richard, coming to the fore as these heroes which defend the Welsh against the treason of the Blue Books. And again, to quote John Davies, that it was the chapel people who were only real Welsh, and that Welshness was aligned with non-conformity. So Carnhuanawc, this conservative Anglican who was so much in favour of Wales, its history and its language, that image, it's the victors who write history, and Carnhuanawc didn't fit this new image. It was William Wraithog and Henry Richards who were the heroes by now, and I think that's one of the great reasons why Carnhuanawc became largely to be forgotten by our day, written out of the history almost. Well, time is going, so to say something about his life and character and his contribution, more specifically now, He was born in the north of Breconshire in Llanwingel, Bryn Pybian, near Cymreigydd. That's a good question. Was it one of the factors that draws attention to this Wales that he was born so close to Cymreigydd and then brought up in Builth, Wales, and his interest in Welsh history was further strengthened when he went to Christ College in Brecon, and the grandson of Theophilus Evans, who wrote Drych y Prif Oesoedd. And Carnhuanawc helped that grandson in producing his second volume, The History of Breconshire, by choosing pictures to go in that book. And Carnhuanawc had and he was actually he actually inherited the llyfr Aneirin, very early manuscript from Theophilus Jones. His Carnhuanawc's father was a vicar, and his father was very interested in antiquaries, and his mother claimed to have been a descendant of a 10th century Welsh prince, and the hearth he lived on, it was a cultured Welsh-language musical hearth, and he was taught to do folk dancing on the hearth, and he followed his father by becoming a curate in Radnorshire for a while, and then a curate in a couple of parishes in the south of Breconshire, and then became the priest of Annual Cymreigydd and rural dean, and he actually there was tension between him and other priests in that area because he wanted to use Welsh so much in the services, but most of the time he was in Cymreigydd, 5 miles south of Annual Cymreigydd. He wasn't married and lived in Cymreigydd, but moved the end of his life to Cymreigydd, and that's where he was buried, about 5 miles north of Cymreigydd, as I said. He was a handsome, tall figure, but also handsome in his character. He was very generous and loyal to people. The name he adopted, Carnhuanawc, the Bardic name, he was in 1824. That name is reflects the kind of humour he had. He used to like using strange lambda plwn like Ignach ap Midro, and Carnhuanawc was stuck with him. Carn can mean a summit or a cairn, but Hanog comes from Hian. So Hian is another name for sun. So this the name means a sunny cairn. He was very generous to the poor. He loved animals and the world of nature. He had a number of pets. Gwenny, the owl, and Bobby, the ferret, and who used to eat from the same table as him. He loved hedgehogs as well, and like Loyal Morganwg, he liked to walk rather than to ride a horse. And he was very similar to Iolo. He had a great interest in the history of Wales, a great interest in the Druids, and in things like cromlechs, etc. He loved Wales and the Welsh language like Iolo, and he was a polymath like Iolo. He was incredibly intelligent, but in his mind and also in speaking and the use of his hands. He was an author, he was an artist, a craftsman. He could play the harp and make harps, and he was a very powerful orator. Compared to Iolo, he wasn't a poet, and Iolo could be quite nasty sometimes, but there was something very warm in Carnhuanawc. He was kind of a bridge builder between people in this period when Wales was becoming more argumentative within itself, and he could inspire people, and he became quite a hero for the nation. He would address the Eisteddfodau, and people would almost worship at his feet. But to finish, what to note, the 3 points I put to my concentration. He was a Welshman who was keen on Welsh medium education in Dale schools and Sunday schools, and he asked people in something he wrote to make sure that children should be educated in the Welsh language, but English as well, but not to support schools where Welsh wasn't used at all. He made his best to encourage the use of Welsh in the Anglican Church, which was a difficult time at the time. A Welsh-speaking bishop wasn't appointed in Wales, which is 1715 and 1870, and many clergy were appointed who are not Welsh-speaking, and their curates had to do as much Welsh as happened. And Carnhuanawc became leader of a pressure group of people at the edges of the hierarchy of the church, who did their best, and many of them lived outside Wales, couldn't get living in Wales themselves, pressing for more use of Welsh in the church. And Carnhuanawc was at the head of the army in that, and he wouldn't accept being made Archbishop of Canterbury if it meant living outside of Wales. He was very obvious among those literary priests who were concerned for encouraging the use of Welsh and its culture, and he was part of the Welsh awakening from 1818 onwards, helping the Welshification movement, Cymreigydd, as it was called, and had a great love for Welsh and its language, Welsh language. He was very involved in the Abergavenny Cymreigyddion, but these societies were appearing all over the country, and Carnhuanawc was very supportive of that, with his volume on Welsh history, very important in helping people become aware of our history. But an extension of his Welshness was his interest in the Celtic countries, especially Brittany. He learned enough Breton to help with the work of editing the translation of the Bible into Breton. And Carnhuanawc was one of those who enabled the publication of the New Testament into Welsh, and an Anglican Christian. but his Christianity was fundamental to all his work, not just his official career. It was fundamental to his his Welshness as well. We see him encouraging the use of Welsh in the Anglican Church, supporting the Bible Society very strongly. He tried to get people to establish, wherever he went, a Welsh Society and a branch of the Bible Society, both those things. And just to quote, if I can, a small part of the way he saw the Welsh language and his Christianity interweaving with each other. In 1834, he writes, "It's strange that the Welsh language has survived so long, given so much enmity against it. But I think that is because she has the great calling to bring through, by the grace of God, the light of the gospel to Wales. She has been honoured by God to be a wonderful instrument for this. But isn't it only the ignorant who would deny her place as God's way of reaching the Welsh people?" He's a very warm character, a mercurial character. He had a finger in every pie in encouraging the Welsh language or culture in the first half of 19th century. He was kind of the glue which glued all the people involved together across the political and religious spectrum. And even though the Cymreigydd movement continued for some time after his death in 1848, the poet E.Wyn says that after the death of Carnhuanawc, that movement was like a body without a breath, and he died at a critical time, just after the treason of the Blue Books, and further divisions in Wales. E.Wyn Brooks in Pam na Fi Cymru asks why this patriotic movement that we see developing at the beginning of the 19th century, why didn't it develop more successfully in Wales, as happened in Hungary and other small nations in Europe during the second half of the 19th century? And he suggests that a great part of that was the Welsh nation had started to be redefined from about 1850 onwards on the basis of literal nonconformity. That was they were the real Welsh, as it were, and the conservative patriots, influenced by Herder, like Carnhuanawc, had been pushed to the sidelines. So one of the questions that we need to ask is, how different would our history have been as a nation in the age of Victoria if Carnhuanawc had lived into the second half of the century? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gwen. We've had another great contribution, and you persuaded me that he was the most modern Welshman in that period. I don't know if you persuaded other people, but maybe we can have an opportunity to ask questions in the last half hour. I'm not going to ask Reverend Hywel Davies to give a vote of thanks, so it's great to be able to thank both of you who have been addressing us today. It's been extremely interesting. I don't know what a teaching technique that Carnhuanawc used to teach a lady Llanova of the language, but he must have touched at some point on the spelling, the orthography disputes. That Carnhuanawc, and in Cardiff we remember his name because of the society establishing his name, but also we've come today to get to know the man today, and thank you for taking that journey and reminding us of the great contribution of this talented cleric, and to Gwendraeth for teaching, educating us about the orthographical argument. That's another reason to be thankful to the bishops. If I could remind Bishop June in this diocese of her duty to those who came before her, to thank E.Wyn and Gwendraeth from the heart for their contribution. Thank you very much, Hywel. I want to mention our next meeting. This webinar number 9 is on the 26th of March at exactly the same time, and the Archbishop E.Wyn Evans on Thomas Burgess and St David's College orthography Maya Jones will discuss Gofal ein Gwinllan, and the chair will be our Archbishop of Wales. So I hope very much you can be with us then. So can I thank you very much, Gwendraeth and E.Wyn, and a very interesting morning, and to every one of you for coming to the meeting, because if you weren't here we couldn't have these webinars. So we thank you very much for your support at all times, and please follow the judging Wales YouTube. So there'll be videos on these videos. Ainsley has the time to do it. It will be on there very quickly.